Well, thanks very much, everybody. I hope you're settling back after a good lunch. I do appreciate that we've got the post-lunch gig, so I have planted some people in the audience who are going to be really kind and applaud, even if I tell a really bad joke. Thank you very much. There they are. But yeah, it's really a great privilege for me to welcome you all to my home turf. This is where I work. I'm just waffling while some people come in from their lunch. But also to introduce you to someone who I'm very pleased to say is a good friend of mine and is the greatest British living nature writer. I think no one would dispute that.
Oldest, I think, is
So, Richard Mabey. We're just checking his mic's okay. I'm not quite sure if it is, but hopefully it is. Can you hear? Hello?
Hello? Yeah, okay.
Okay, that's good. So, I mean, we're here for many things, and I promise that at the end, what Darryl and I have kind of orchestrated is that you will have at least a good 10 minutes of questions. So, because I know, speaking to people last night, night before, oh my God, Richard Mabey's coming to, I've got this, I really want to, like, this book. So there'll be that time, I promise you. But we're here really to frame our conversation around Richard's latest book, which is called The Accidental Garden, which could be challenging for some of you gardeners. I really recommend you get it. I know I would say that, but it is amazing. But I think probably the first thing that I should be getting Richard to answer for us, for those very few of you who haven't read the book yet, what's an accidental garden, Richard?
Well, in our case, it's a garden where the majority of things that happen aren't planned by the gardener. So, the arrival of plants, the collapse of trees, the mysteries of underground mycorrhizal organisation are not in my hands at all. There were a lot of reasons for this, why I kind of embarked on this book. One, I should confess, is entirely physical. I'm a decrepit old man now, and the business of doing serious physical work in the garden is a little bit beyond me now. So maybe everything I say philosophically is a justification for that. But right through my life, writing life, I suppose, the questions about the natural world's own autonomy and agenda have been absolutely central in my writing. And it occurred to me that nowhere do these questions become more acute and personal than inside a garden. When you think about it, the fact of having a garden gives you the most preposterous license. Here you are with a finite piece of land on a finite planet, and you can do what you bloody well like on it. And I think this will probably sound outrageous to you. If we are talking about a human community, the things we do in gardens, the organisation, the planning, the disruption, would be called colonialism. We are using a system of living beings to produce our own satisfaction. Now, I do this myself, but it seemed to me worth asking the questions about it. We talk a lot about reconnecting with nature and being in nature in the garden. But basically, all this is a cover for simply being in control. Even when we're benign and we build bug hotels and plant wildflower meadows, we are in the driving seat. And I think that we need to acknowledge that. And if we're approaching, as I hope, in the larger discussions about the planet, we're prepared to give nature more of a free hand to see what it wants to do. For me, this is an ethical question as much as a practical one. You know, I think it's right to give these other beings the chance to work out some of their own life stories, not being totally directed by us. So it occurred to me that in quite a large part of our garden, we could aim for what I would call parallel development. That is, we do some of the things that gardeners normally do. There's a little vegetable patch. But also, there would be a large stretch whose structure and workings were determined not by me, but by the natural system itself. So that's the accidental garden. One doesn't know what's going to happen next. One has to be morally prepared to accept even bad things, trees falling down, crushing other trees. Great opportunity here for living systems to build something new and dynamic. So really it's about suggesting that not abandoning gardening, but being prepared to confront this paradox that we think we're being nice to nature, but in fact what we're doing is controlling it. And I just wanted to take the leash off.
Yeah.
So Richard, in the book, you talk about the development of the garden, and it started off in a fairly traditional way of making a garden.
I'm not going to hear you very well.
Okay, yeah. So,
Speak loud.
yep, sure. So in the book, you talk about making your garden, and you started off in a fairly traditional way of making a garden like most other people might make gardens. So it's been this transition over a period of time. So could you just sort of describe that transition over how many years did that happen until you got to the point where you are now, where you sort of have got this embodied philosophy in the garden?
Okay. What we inherited in what was about only a 2-acre plot was somebody else's garden, stamped with things like leylandii and variegated shrubs, and with a quite large expanse of grass that was obviously mown maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks. So it began, what we inherited was a very controlled place. And for my bit, my partner Polly does the vegetable garden et al. For my bit, the wild end, it was a question of reversing the control that had been exerted over those bits. So, we mowed the grass, cut the grass rather, with a professional hay cutter, and then encouraged wild plants to colonize of their own accord. We didn't go through the conventional way of buying favored species in little plugs and planting them out in the grass. I scattered some handfuls of things like yellow rattle, picked up some seeds from wayside verges, trod them in, made use of all the ruptured patches of the grass, where there were molehills, and scattered stuff in there. I set fire to it a couple of times, thinking Paleolithic style, and gradually the wild species began to colonize. And now, 20 years later, it is a very remarkable patch of grassland with something like 80 flowering plant species, including 1 or 2 rarities. And what's most remarkable to me is that my one annual act of control, that is having the grass cut so that it continues to be grassland, I standing in for the herbivores that we don't have, the rest of the management is being done by the wild species themselves. We have tremendous number of yellow meadow ant hills in the garden, which are very, very active. And they are one of the chief agents for redistributing seeds, especially primulas. I'm sure most of you will know this, but many seeds have a tiny globule of fat at the end of them called an eliosome. Ants gather seeds, take them back to their nests, take off the little globule of fat, feed it to their larvae, and then scatter the seeds out in their litter dumps. So ants are profound agents of dispersal of wild plant seeds. And we found this. I mean, after 20 years, the cowslips on our bit of grassland, I mean, they look like lemon curd at the beginning of April. So that's one wild agent over which, thankfully, I have no control, which is managing the grassland for me. Yellow rattle, of course, does it as well, parasitizing up to 7 or 8 species of wild plant, especially grasses, and reducing their growth. And even the birds help. We have some resident moorhens, which are, in a sense, our garden familiars, and are occasionally arboreal nesting. We have an ancient ash growing out of a pond, and one year, started about 3 years ago, the moorhens, having been despicably bad parents for most of their time with us, decided to nest 15 feet up in the ash tree and to watch them with their extraordinary clumsy feet climbing the tree was a wonder. And even more to see the young parachuting down from the nest into the pond. So anyway, the moorhens are regular little herbivores, and even their tiny tracks, which become quite regular through the meadow, become a different sort of habitat in which twining plants like tufted vetch and vetchling take advantage of. So we have this group of plants, animals, insects, which are managing the grassland for us. The next thing was the bit of wood. We, again, the end of this bit of grass that we inherited, there were about 8 30, 40-year-old mature trees, ash, oak, whatever. And I hoped that they would spread. And being a pragmatist, you may not believe this, but I am, I did plant some extra trees amongst them of species I thought wouldn't make it of their own accord, like hornbeam and field maple and hazel. But I hasten to add that I planted them without any of the intensive care accessories that seem to be regarded as essential for trees to live. Stakes and plastic tubes and mulches and watering. We did none of that. And all the trees survived magnificently. They were nibbled a bit by muntjacs and roe deer, but they survived. And in addition to that, thank goodness, we've had the most wonderful natural regeneration. So between all these trees is now a matrix of the few species that I planted, plus large numbers of young cherry, oak, and hazel. Don't believe Oliver Rackham that hazel will never regenerate in this country. It certainly does in our garden. And we now have a very variegated wood with about 3 different stories in it. So I think that's probably enough. That's the answer to your question about how we transitioned.
Richard's very kind as well, though. So Polly and Richard, when they popped over, I have a 2-acre patch similarly, but mine is a field, and I've been gradually renaturing this field. One of the first things that they offered when they came over was cuttings from their gorgeous wildflower meadow that I could then scatter everywhere over my field. So this idea of sharing the seed that you can get from the wild is a lovely way of going about things. And I think one of the things that I particularly like about this book, all Richard's books, to be honest, is the literary kind of layerings that kind of come in. So really early on in the book, you quote R.S. Thomas, and you talk about how the garden is a gesture against the wild. And this idea that, you know, whatever we do is always just going to be kind of just a little something, which I really like. Can you talk about the other kind of literary references that you think kind of evolved to this philosophy of the accidental garden?
Well, Andrew Marvell, of course, is a wonderful writer about wild ecosystems, especially grasslands. I engaged quite a lot with his big poem called The Garden, The Mower Against Gardens as well. I was very happy to find in one of his letters from Appleton House, no, one of his verses that he wrote when he was gardening at Appleton House in Yorkshire, about I can't remember the quote exactly, as if the plants are saying, don't worry, you can leave it all to us. And I like that. Who else? John Clare, of course, figures quite a lot. A man who also, I think, was prepared to allow autonomy to wild species. Some of his best poems, his most moving poems, are viewing the situation from the wild organism's point of view. There's a wonderful one called To the Snipe, which views a marshland as if from the point of view of a snipe, and its terror and nervousness and adaptive qualities. He also, of course, wrote an entire poem in the voice of a piece of land. The Lament of Swardy Well is one of the great poems of natural liberation, if you like, in that he makes this piece of rough common land near Helpsome speak out against the ravages that it's experienced at the hands of landowners. It begins, I'm Swardy Well, a piece of land that lies outside the town. And it goes on with a piece of land, proclaiming its indignities and what it would like to do instead.
You mentioned this earlier when we were talking about these sorts of speaking in the voice of others, other species, and you mentioned that that's problematic. Could you just sort of explain that to everyone? The problem of trying to speak in the voice of another species?
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Can you interpret?
I think kind of anthropomorphizing by taking the voice of the land or the voice of the snipe, like we were saying.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's better than it not being allowed a voice at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What Claire was doing, I mean, he almost was quite deliberate and particular about this, was to become a spokesperson for other creatures. And you can see this is so much of the stuff he wrote. I mean, his wonderful poem, The Nightingale's Nest, is one of the great poems on behalf of a wild creature. I think the reservation I expressed there was a very academic one about whether, when any of us speak on behalf of the wild, we are committing an impertinence.
Sure.
Because, I mean, I do think that the very worst part of our attitude towards the natural world at the moment is one of patronization. That is the belief that it is perennially a victim, and that the only way it can possibly survive is for us to protect it. It's infantilizing the natural world, which is much tougher and more inventive than we give it credit for.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And many of you will know, but I run this MA that I will bore you to tears about, but it's called Wild Writing from this University of Essex. And one of the things that really, in the first seminar, we really try and get across to all students to remind them, and it is a reminder. It's because we often do this thing of saying, oh, I'm going to step into nature. You can't ever step into nature. It is impossible. We are all of nature. Even if this, insanely humanly constructed facade that we're in now, we're in nature. We are nature. We're of nature. So that kind of contrast, that kind of clinical division, I don't think helps us in any of this sort of debate about climate change, about climate emergency, etc. I think this is one of the things that's really important. I think one of the tensions in the book that I really like is this idea of human intervention, if you like. Human intervention, whether it's in the garden or on a larger area of land, or whether it's a window box or whatever. This is something we've discussed quite a lot, isn't it? So, I mean, where do you stand with this idea of human intervention? Do you just say, like, we keep it to an absolute minimum?
No, obviously not. Intervention is a very aggressive word.
It is.
And I do think that one of the things all of us should do in the current state of affairs is to look at the language we use about the natural world. Yeah. I'm appalled by the fact that all of us who love living beings can resort to the language of Suella Braverman when we talk about visitors to our country, alien invaders and such like. And I also think that the word nature itself ought to be junked. I obviously agree with James that we are part of nature, but as soon as you take that stand, nature loses any meaning as a word, because it means that also all the things that humans do are natural. Nuclear weapons, climate change, these are all entirely natural because they're caused by humans, which are part of nature. Nature used in that sense of a discriminatory category is a very recent, well, comparatively recent, just a few centuries old. Yeah. Nature always traditionally just meant the quality of things, and it probably is only with the extreme separation between ourselves and other beings that happened with intensive agriculture that caused the word nature to mean something different from us. I try not to use the word because it seems to me to have become quite meaningless. I mean, a category that embraces volcanoes, viruses, potpourris, herbal remedies, eclipses, volcanoes, whatever, and all the things that we do if we define ourselves as part of the natural world, it's a redundant word. If it means everything, it means nothing. So I think we either retain the old separation, saying we are humans, there is the natural world, or we junk it all together.
Yeah.
Can we just pick up on that language issue? And you were talking, about migrants, etc. And you talk about plant migration in the book, and that we have to find an accommodation with it because it's happening anyway.
An accommodation with?
With migrant plants. Our ecosystems are changing because of that.
I like it. I mean, you've used a slightly nicer term, migrant plants. Why not just visitors? Yes, of course we have to find an accommodation.
Well, it's happening, whether we like it or not, is what you said.
What else has to find an accommodation? Yeah. I mean, I think when visiting organisms come to us who've not lived here before, obviously all kinds of accommodations have to be made. And I think that as well as the inconvenience they may cause to us, we should consider the opinions of the resident ecosystems that they're colonizing. And in a very large number of cases, we find that plants from overseas don't cause any trouble at all. In our garden, we've got some wonderfully creative foreign visitors. It astonished me, very belatedly, to find that the massive oak at the end of our garden was a turkey oak. I didn't spot this for nearly 15 years because it has a huge crown, and I just assumed it was a native oak. But it's doing very well. It has a large number of the lichens and insect species of native oak, and it's a great adaptive colonizer. Many of the seedling trees that we have in our garden are turkey oak. They're more resistant to browsing by deer, and probably better suited to the climate that we're about to enter. And I would say this about visiting organisms, that we are in a state of fantastic turbulence in the global environment and in our own environment, which is causing some species great stress. And if we don't allow in species which are adapted to the conditions we are going to experience in this country, we're going to have a depleted set of ecosystems. So I'm afraid I'm all for the settlers that are coming in from the hot regions of the earth, provided they get on well with the ecosystems they're visiting.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the book, you talk about this, the duty to welcome them in, these visitors from abroad that are coming with climate change, which is a really quite a different message, perhaps. I mean, we've talked quite a lot in some really interesting sessions about this idea of, the use of the word native and non-native and how, that's problematic. Neophyte is being, used as well. So I think this idea of welcoming the visitors and maybe challenging them if they're problematic, of course, but, I don't know. If the monkey flower is providing pollination around the pond and it's just come in, is that okay? It's that kind of debate that needs to happen, perhaps. I wondered if we could just have a little bit, because I love that idea of this approach, which is this sort of wild approach, if you like. Where do you think that's come from? Why do you believe that? And I wondered if it was from your childhood. You talk in the book a little bit about your childhood going into the childhood garden, and I was thinking about even like Merlin yesterday with being allowed a little space in the family garden where he could dig a hole, and you would escape from your home into this amazing childhood garden. Would you, just because some people might not have read the book, would you tell us a little bit about that world?
Yeah, I mean, I'm old enough to have been in that happy time when kids were allowed to play unfettered and not have social services descend on you if that happened. So yeah, we lived at the edge of a country town in the Chilterns, and at the end of our garden there was about 50, 60 acres of wild parkland, which happened to be the abandoned estate of Graham Greene's uncle, Charles, who lived in the Hall. It was demolished in the 1920s. So this was the most extraordinary habitat. It was rough grassland with groups of trees, both native and planted, and lots of fabulous scrubland. And of course, we built camps in there, learnt how to make butter by churning it on the back wheel of an upturned bicycle, a little jar of cream. And the best camp we ever had was in the roots, one of the big chestnut trees, sweet chestnut trees in the area, blew down one night and it scooped out this huge hole in the ground, overhung by roots, and we had a fabulous camp inside that. And of course also up cedars of Lebanon, which were very popular at the time this parkland was created. And cedars of Lebanon were like living in a high-rise system. The branches cause very flat plateaus, which collect debris from higher up. So you could actually walk about 2 stories up in a cedar of Lebanon. And they were very good memories, those being up those cedar trees. So yeah, we ran about like aboriginals in this place, And most of us didn't have rural backgrounds. A lot of us were urban overspills, like my parents who'd moved out of London when the war began. And somehow we sussed it. We somehow knew what things were for, how you could do things with them, which grasses it was that you could draw Chinese burns on the hairs at the back of people's necks, which were the best leaves for roofing camps with. And I don't know where it came from, but just maybe our primates' instincts at pottering and investigating came to our rescue here. So it was a question of real trial and error. at the most fundamental level. So I think a lot, an assumption that this is where we belonged. Not to, I mean, we didn't try to garden or organize a field. We lived in it as one of its wild species. And I think that probably got ingrained in me as a moral lesson about where we belonged. Because I think it's a matter of scale. When you talk about human intervention, how about replacing that with human participation? Before I moved to East Anglia, I said I lived in the Chilterns. I owned, for want of a better word, or had custody of, a 16-acre wood, ancient wood. And I ran it as a community project. We had no management plans or anything like that. So we had a kind of on-site democracy where the village people and friends, we'd get there and talk about what we felt about the place and how we felt we might like to inject ourselves into it. So we built up a system of footpaths, not again by planning, but simply by following desire lines and deer tracks. And gradually the place assembled itself. We did a bit of thinning because the previous owner had planted the place up with hybrid poplars for the match trade. So we took a lot of those out. But fundamentally, I think, when I look back, we were just trying to live in the wood, not manage it, as one of the other forest creatures, like bark beetles or the vast dynasty of badgers we had in there. So that was...
Yeah, that's nice. That's really nice. It is that thing, education trust is shining in my face, and you kind of think that's that thing about if you let children be wild, you create wilder gardens, don't you? It's pretty simple. I'm slightly conscious that we did promise the audience a significant period of time for asking questions, because I think there might be a few. And something just flashed up. So if you're starting to go in that direction, should we? Yeah, I see people.
Can you?
I will interpret. Yeah.
Sorry about my hearing.
No, not at all.
Okay. Paul Farley wrote a book called Edgelands, and I just wonder, we've talked in this conference about the edges, the spaces where chaos and order meet. And I just wonder if you've got any thoughts, particularly the edges of towns. I wonder if you've got thoughts on edges, Richard, in terms of particularly in respect to this book.
I got it. Thank you. Yeah, of course, let's not forget Richard wrote The Unofficial Countryside, which was kind of almost started psychogeography of the countryside. But anyway, we won't forget, that was in 73 or something. The question was about Paul Farley writing a book about edgelands and this idea of the kind of edges. And the question was sort of about the idea of edges between regions, if you like, and the importance.
Order.
Between chaos and order.
Yeah, not quite sure what the question is, but edges obviously occur everywhere, not just between city and suburbs and countryside, but everywhere inside all those systems as well. We have an edge in our accidental garden. The house is surrounded by a 4-meter wide strip of gravel on 4 sides, obviously put in there by the owner as a kind of moat or a cordon sanitaire to say this is where growth ends and the house begins. But it's been the most wonderful explosive seedbed in our garden. Extraordinary plants have come and settled there. Strange crossbreeds between geraniums, that lovely little new thing that is really careering around East Anglia now, the Pyrenean cranespill, Geranium pyrenaicum, which is now called hedgerow cranespill, I think, and has become a hugely colourful ingredient of spring verges in East Anglia now. Anyway, it's also a very colourful ingredient in our gravel. But we have We have valerian from the Mediterranean growing in the sauna of the exhaust from the boiler, and a plant that is host in our garden to hummingbird hawk moths if we're lucky.
Wow.
And if we're having lunch outside, we always turn the chairs round so we can watch them and cheer them. And a very bizarre hybrid rose, whose origins I have no notion about at all, but a cross between a Rosa arvensis, a field rose, and maybe rambling rector. But anyway, it looks like a cactus when it's in bloom. Racemes of 100 or more flowers on the top of each stalk, scented of nutmeg, and turning with strange vermilion stripes as it goes over. So, yeah, that's meant to be a boundary. But the point about edgelands is that things seep into them from both directions and create something which is quite new.
Yeah. Great, thank you, thank you.
Owen.
Hello, thank you. So you mentioned a bit about control, which you painted fairly negatively, and then also used the word participation, which seemed more positive. So in kind of practical terms, how do we know when we're in controlling, or how do we know when we're actually being more about participating? And I'd like to give an example with, sometimes there's already something interesting happening, there's lots of diversity for which you to participate in. You arrive at the party, it's already in full swing and you can just join in. Or sometimes you arrive and there's no party there and someone needs to get it started. And I wondered if in that situation, maybe control but allowing those wild elements as well, embracing the self-seeders, creating the conditions in which nature, as you say, can run its own course, and you too can steer it a little bit and get it going off, get it going to the best start. What are your practical tips on that and the distinction between control and participation?
Did you get that?
Condense.
The two terms that I really like. So on one level, you've got control by humans, and on the other level, you've got participation. What advice would you give of kind of when you have to control, or are there any situations where you do have to control things within the garden scenario, or when can you participate, if you like? Good question.
I think the first thing I would say is you need to ask yourself very hard questions about why you think you need to control. Are you just obeying some social convention, as they do in America, for instance, where the height of the lawn and the kind of species you can allow to grow wild in your garden are actually legislated for? So any wild species taller than, I think, about 3 inches is prohibited by law in a lot of places in the United States. So you need to ask, why am I controlling? Is it just for my convenience, not to annoy the neighbors, because I have a particular whim to grow this plant? Okay, that's fine. But ask that question first. And I think that participation is about changing the scale at which we work. If you can imagine yourself as an inhabitant of your garden rather than the overall controlling gardener, think about the scale at which earthworms work, or ladybirds work. And if you can match that intimacy with your own work, then I think you're allowed to say, I'm working in nature.
Thanks, great question, really good question. Intimacy, that's nice. Any other questions? I think we've got a couple more minutes, have we?
One more question.
Yes. I'm happy to go to the audience. I'm very happy to ask my own questions. I think this one. Thanks.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So historically, when our climate has warmed and cooled in between glaciations, plants have kind of redistributed themselves around our whole planet. But as the kind of human-caused climate change is so quick, some plants don't have time to kind of naturally redistribute. Do you think it is our kind of duty to help some species do that?
Thanks. Good question. Tricky one to translate. So kind of like, that idea that over geological periods of glacial change, plants naturally kind of redistribute them across the planet. When things are happening fast, climate emergency, do you think then we should be stepping in and redistributing? I think I might know the answer.
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge. The point at which we trust ourselves to have sufficient knowledge to make ecosystems ourselves. But do we? I mean, it's a question which I repeatedly ask myself in my own garden. It's probably 3,000 years since our garden had anything like semi-natural vegetation on it. Yeah. Maybe there were a few patches during the plague or something where it might have reverted. But basically, it's been an organized agricultural patch back to the Neolithic. So I think if I use that word restoration, which of course is very fashionable now, the assumption being that we know when or what we are restoring it to, should I be introducing ancient woodland plants into our patch of secondary woodland? I honestly don't know the answer to that. I have done a few. I planted some wild garlic because we love to use it in the house. But should I put bluebells in? Primroses and wood violets have found their own way in, so I'm encouraged by that. And you can begin to see the very long cycle by which, a man-made wood becomes semi-natural by colonization. But as our friend says, the pace of change at the moment is so colossal. I'm just worried that we might do it wrong. And if the choice is, okay, here's a piece of land, blank. What is the difference between allowing it to become a naturally vegetated system and planting all the plants ourselves? I can envisage the creation of an ecological utopia where you take a large patch of land, you plant all the species you think you should be there, all the herbaceous species in the grassland, you start them off properly in their little pots, and you create the kind of place that you think might have existed at the end of the last glaciation. But it's a fake. And maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I have a slight belief in authenticity and a belief that wildness is a process as well as a collection of species, and that it ought to be our duty to conserve that process along with the species itself.
Brilliant. Well, great way to
I'm
end.
not entirely sure of that.
Thank you very much.